Alright, we're going to talk about quadratic equations. A quadratic equation is an equation that can be written in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c equals, let's say, y. Alright, it's important first to notice we said with linear equations your degree was going to equal 1. Well, for quadratic equations it's going to equal 2. Your highest exponent is going to be 2. There's going to be 3 methods that we can use to solve these equations. The first method is factoring. The second method is using the quadratic formula. And then the last method is going to be completing the square. Now with a quadratic equation, you should always have 2 solutions, and that goes back to my degree is 2, so that's why I should have 2 solutions. Alright, so let's look at our first problem. We're going to use the factoring method. Alright, this should be a review of what we did on our first test. So notice I have a coefficient in front of my x squared terms. It's a trinomial, so I'm going to have to use bridge. So if I bridge, I need 2 numbers that multiply to negative 18 and that add to positive 7. So 2 numbers that are going to multiply to negative 18 and add to positive 7 are going to be 9x and a negative 2. So I'm going to break that up, bring my last term down, bring my first term down. Now I factor by grouping. So I'm going to group the first 2 and the last 2 together. I can take a 3x out of the first 2. I can take a negative 1 out of the last 2. So when I rewrite it, I'm going to get 3x minus 1 times 2x plus 3 equals 0. Now we're just taking it one more step. We're going to set each part equal to 0. So I'm going to set 3x minus 1 equal to 0, and then 2x plus 3 equal to 0. So if I solve for x, I'm going to get x equals 1/3 and x equals negative 3/2. Alright, our next problem, we don't have to use bridge because there's no coefficient in front of our x squared term. So we're just going to find 2 numbers that multiply to 14 and add to 9. So my 2 numbers are going to be 7 and 2. So it'll be factored x plus 7, x plus 2. So if I set both of those equal to 0, I'm going to get x equals negative 7 and x equals negative 2. So those 2 will be my final answers. Alright, now that we discussed factoring, we're going to talk about the quadratic formula. So before we write the quadratic formula down, remember our quadratic equations are going to be in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c. So the quadratic formula is saying x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So the a is the coefficient in front of the x squared. The b is the coefficient in front of x, and the c is going to be the last number of your trinomial. Alright, let's look at our first example. It's important to make sure if we're using the quadratic formula that everything is on one side. So in this case, my a value is 3, my b is an understood 1 in front of that x, so my b is 1, and then my c value is negative 6. So if I go ahead and plug it into the quadratic formula, I'm going to get x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. Now, we can go ahead and enter all of this into our calculator. So if we enter 1 squared minus 4 times 3 times negative 6 into our calculator, we're going to get negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 25, which in this case, square root of 25 is going to be 5. So we have negative 1 plus or minus 5 divided by 6. Now you're going to work both of those out individually. So I'm going to say negative 1 plus 5 divided by 6. And then you're also going to say negative 1 minus 5 divided by 6. So if I take the first one, I'm going to get negative 1 plus 5 is 4. 4 divided by 6 is going to be 4 over 6, which reduces to 2/3. Negative 1 minus 5 over 6 will reduce down to negative 1. So negative 1 is an answer, and 2/3 is also an answer. Alright, like I mentioned on the previous example, we need everything on one side in order to use the quadratic formula. So the first thing I'm going to do is distribute the x. So after I distribute the x, I'm going to go ahead and combine like terms and move everything on one side. So I'm going to get x squared, and then I have a 3x and a 2x. So if I combine that, I'm going to get plus x, and then I'm going to subtract this 12, move it over to the other side. So I'm going to get negative 12 equals 0. So in this case, my a value is going to equal 1, my b is also 1, and my c is going to be negative 12. So if I go ahead and plug that in, I'm going to get x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all over 2 times 1. So if I enter that in, so we're entering what we call the discriminant in underneath our calculator. In our calculator, we're going to get 1 plus 28, or sorry, 1 plus 48. So we're going to get the square root of 49 over 2. So that's going to equal to negative 1 plus or minus 7 over 2. So if we work both of those out, we say negative 1 plus 7 over 2. That's going to give us 6 divided by 2, which is 3. So 3 is an answer. And then you work the negative 1 out. So you're going to get negative 8 divided by 2, which will be negative 4. So again, it's important to remember when we're using the quadratic formula, we need to make sure we move everything on one side. So it needs to be in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. Alright, for the last method, we're going to talk about completing the square. So the first step with completing the square, we want to isolate all the terms that have an x on it. So anything that has an x on it, we're getting on one side. Everything else, we're moving to the other. Then we're going to take half the coefficient of x, square it, and add it to both sides. Once we've added it to both sides, we're going to be able to factor the trinomial, and this should be a perfect square. That's very important. So when we factor the trinomial, it's going to be a perfect square. And then we're going to take the square root of both sides and isolate x. So I'm going to give you a second to finish copying down these 4 steps, and then we'll go over an example. Alright, so let's take a look at our first example. So the first step says isolate my x's, or get all my x's on one side. So that means I'm going to take this 15 and move it to the other side. So I'm going to have x squared plus 8x, and I move the 15 over to the other side. And I'm going to leave room to add something on both sides. So the second step says take half of the coefficient of x. So I'm going to take, in this case, half of 8. So 8 divided by 2 is 4. Then it says square it. So I square it, and I get 16. So I'm going to add 16 to both sides. So after I add 16 to both sides, we're going to be able to factor this trinomial. So we're looking for 2 numbers that multiply to 16 and add to 8. So those 2 numbers are going to be 4 and 4. So it's a perfect square. So you'll be able to factor it as x plus 4 squared equals, then we're going to take negative 15 plus 16, which is 1. Now to get rid of this squared, we're simply just going to take the square root of both sides. So we're going to get x plus 4 equals the square root of 1 is going to be plus or minus 1. Then I isolate x, so I subtract 4. So I'm going to actually add those together. So I'm going to say negative 4 plus 1 is going to give me negative 3. And then I take negative 4 minus 1, and I get negative 5. So negative 3 and negative 5 are my final answers. Now I'm going to hold off on going over the last example. We'll go over that last example in class. Please make sure if you have any questions that you write them down and you ask them at the beginning of class.